Welcome to Mind and Heart. I'm Sister John Dominic, a foundress of the Dominican Sisters of Mary, Mother of the Eucharist. It has been my joy to have been involved in Catholic education for over 30 years. One of my privileges for the community has been to create Lumen Ecclesiae Press, a publishing organization that develops educational resources used now by over 500 schools around the United States and the world. Lumen Ecclesiae is our call to magnanimity, our call to be large-souled, to do something greater for the Church. So today, I invite anyone interested in becoming a saint to join with us as we unpack the deep beauty, mystery, and certainties of our faith to transform our lives so that we can know, love, and serve God with our mind and heart. Welcome to this episode of Mind and Heart. And on today's episode, I'm going to be speaking to Sister Albert Marie, one of the sisters in our community who really has done something, I think, extraordinary for theology, for the Church, and that is really bringing the writings of her patron, St. Albert the Great, and made it accessible to those of us who may not have the talent of understanding Latin or to be able to translate it. But before we dive into her book, which she's going to really give us an understanding of it and a nice overview on it, I thought we could just take a moment, Sister, and just talk about your vocation, your background, why you took St. Albert the Great as your patron, because I think that probably pretty much shaped everything you were thinking about as you were writing this. So if you could share that with us, that would be great.
Sure. So I entered the community out of college, and I'd heard about St. Albert, and I've read some of St. Thomas's theology, but didn't really have a connection with him until I entered. But I knew that the patron I wanted for my name would be a Dominican, so someone who'd sort of lived that Dominican tradition, and I had a lot of respect for the interest in philosophy and theology that was part of the Dominican tradition. So, as you might know, St. Albert was sort of the second generation of Dominicans. He entered the order after Dominic had died, so they didn't overlap, but before St. Thomas Aquinas, and was helpful in teaching Thomas and sort of shaping the Dominican academic charism of teaching and studying the theology and philosophy. So, when I was reading the lives of St. Albert, he's interesting because probably his greatest contributions are in theology and philosophy, but he was also interested in science, astronomy, the world around him, and just had this sort of global sense that everything in the world is from God and connects to God and is really interesting because of that. So one of the quotes of his that I came across was, all of creation is theology because the heavens declare the glory of God. And he's quoting that Psalm 19 there, the heavens declare the glory of God. And that was a psalm that was really dear to me because I grew up in Canada on a farm, and part of how I learned to pray was just spending time outside, and it was silence in the fields. It was a good place for contemplation if you went for a walk, and just seeing how beautiful it was. And I remember as a teenager thinking, I need some words from Scripture to help me pray. So I got the Bible and was going through the Psalms because I knew that was a good place to look for prayers. And that was a psalm I stopped at. The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament shows forth the work of your hands. So that was sort of my favorite psalm. And then to see St. Albert also devotionally, loving and quoting that psalm sort of clinched that decision that he was the one who would be a good patron. So.
And what I love so much, too, about St. Albert the Great, with my experience in Catholic education, too, of course we know that, St. Thomas is looked to as being the patron of Catholic education, but everything we see in St. Thomas Aquinas, he learned from his teacher, who is his mentor. And what I love with Albert is that you have a patron saint of science or math, and that it's so... because with the Dominican, the charism is truth.
Right.
And that it's not, of course, philosophy and theology are essential, but as you said, all the other sciences. And was there anything in particular, he had a love for that, and he sought the truth. Was there anything like that from knowing him personally, from study and having a connection about his life that you've read about any of the other sciences that he, math or science or?
I haven't read that many of his works on the other sciences. I mean, he studies everything. Apparently, he studies like spiders and how they make their webs. And one life of his was mentioning that he was studying the nervous system and the skeletal system, and noticing the importance of the spine and the head, and sort of as the foundation of the study of the nervous system. So there's apparently he predicted that if you went to the North Pole or the South Pole, animals would be white because sort of that camouflage with the snow. So there's a lot of interesting things, but I haven't had a chance to explore them that much.
And that's just the, like you said, just how for yourself and just the contemplation and really recognizing, the beauty of all that God has created. And that's what's really, I think, we understand this in philosophy and theology, that we see that, God he created all of this for us, and for us to be able to give praise and worship to him. And so I want to kind of move into, with your studies, what led you to do this work, and maybe you could give us some background on the title and what you did to accomplish taking the writings of St. Albert the Great and translating them for us. Right.
So this work started as a dissertation project at Ave Maria University. Right. So I was studying down there, and one of the professors, Father Matthew Lamb, really emphasizes that, theology is a tradition in which you have wisdom passed on from those who came before. So one of the possibilities for a dissertation project was doing a translation and then also analyzing the theology. So the translation sort of is a research piece, and then there is some substantial theological analysis for the sort of original contribution piece. So I thought, well, if I'm going to spend a couple years focusing on one author or one work, I'd like to get to know St. Albert the Great more. And he writes in Latin, and Latin's a language that I studied as an undergraduate and am capable in. So I was looking through the works of St. Albert, and just looking through them, he wrote hundreds and hundreds of pages, and a very, very small percentage of his works are in English. Most of them are in Latin.
Oh, in Latin, wow.
Because they've been studied somewhat, but, a couple generations ago, everyone studying at that level knew Latin. So I searched through and I picked this particular one. So I translated his De Corpore Domini, On the Body of the Lord, partly because it's a Eucharistic work. So as a member of our community, the Eucharist is very, very easy to love and be connected to.
Exactly.
And I also chose this work because it was written near the end of Albert's life, so probably the 1270s. His life kind of spans the 1200s, but he dies in the 1280s. And it's a mixed sort of, mixed in style, that it has some very academic scholastic parts, but it also has some sort of meditational, very beautiful parts that are more like the monastic theology of St. Bernard or the generations before. So it sort of had more beauty of language than some of his other works. And I knew if I was going to spend a couple years working on a piece, I wanted something that would be beautiful as well as interesting. Yeah.
So I would imagine that, here you are, you have your patron saint that you've studied. Yeah. You're reading the writings that have not been translated. Unless you understood Latin, you could read it, but they'd never been translated into English. It had to have been an amazing, I'm sure I'm not challenging, but it had to have been a very, spiritual experience during that time to just all of a sudden come across something and to carry that. What was that like for you?
Yeah, it was a mixture. There's moments where you're just, what's this we're doing here? What's the format of this sentence? And then you sort of step back and look at the ideas and the overall shape. And there are moments where it was just very beautiful, like where he talks about the light of the Lord shining on you in the Eucharist. And there were a lot of, it definitely informed my meditations a lot during that year.
So what do you say about the light? I love that, though, the light of the Lord shining on you. So managing like in times of adoration, or how did he just...
well, I mean, the Eucharistic adoration is just starting at this
right,
time.
That's true, during that time.
12:15 is when you have the elevation of the host starting. So it's just at that moment.
Right.
He's a little bit Platonic. He has a strong sense of God as the first source of all goodness, and this like overflowing or shining. He's always using those language of like water or light coming down from the Lord to us.
That's beautiful.
And for him, the Eucharist is this most important moment in which we come in contact with that light, joy, power from the Lord. So there's parts of it that are really, really beautiful to read in Eucharistic adoration or with adoration, because he just has this sense of flowing down from God to us. And even though he's not having those hours of adoration the same way that we do with the host exposed, that idea really, really is in there.
Understood.
And he does talk about attending Mass and like when the host is held up and looking at that and being that being a moment of prayer and desire to receive the Lord.
And then what I'm hearing you describing in this is that, that he has, it's not just it is an academic writing, because of course he was a professor in a Dominican, but also there's the meditative aspect of it. So it really feeds both your mind and your heart.
Some sections really are meditations, and he'll be like quoting St. Bernard's really beautiful language, and then taking off with it. And then there's other places where he's much more, should someone in this state receive the Eucharist, why or why not, et cetera, et cetera. So
a little more of a dogmatic doctrinal teaching part.
Yeah, both of those are in there.
And you mentioned, so there's like six names for the Eucharist that used for the frame of that. It's probably been a while since you did. Can you remember? Or I have grace for those people who are listening. So we have grace, gift,
food, communion, sacrifice, and sacrament. Yeah, and it was interesting, sort of why those 6 names, because there's Eucharist isn't one of them, and there's other things that you might have thought would be body, blood. I mean, those words are used in the work, but it seems like those are all words used for the Eucharist that come from the liturgy. So he's sort of Albert, near the end of his life, was called upon to be a bishop for a few years, and that affected his theology a little bit. And some people think that it was that pastoral forming the priests of his diocese or concern for priests of his diocese, and that real focus on the liturgy that maybe made him choose those 6 for this work.
When you write, especially if you think about it, because these would be, like understanding, what you receive the grace, we receive God's life, it's a gift, you're going to be nourished by him, communion, if he's kind of moved into this thing where he's teaching priest, not that I'm as close to it as you are, but can you see why there would be a logic to the choice? Did that come clear to you as you were translating that? Yeah,
so there is just a sense of like God being first and then every good thing coming from him. So sort of grace, this freely given, something freely given from God in the sense of coming from him and blessing us. And then gift is similar, but focusing more on what's given. And there's a beautiful section in there where he talks about the Eucharist is given individually to each one, giving what they need. He compares it to the manna in the Old Testament, where each one gathered and they had exactly what they needed. And sort of the Lord will give you in the Eucharist particularly what you need at that moment. And then food, of course, he's given as food. And then communion is a result of that, right? We receive him, we're fed, and then we're in union with him and in union with others. And then sacrifice and sacrament are a little bit more technical. He wants to connect it back to the Old Testament sacrifices. And then under sacrament, he goes through a lot of the sort of classic medieval questions, sort of how do we understand Christ's presence? How do we understand the appearances, the accidents of the bread and wine? He goes through some really technical questions at the end, which he's not the code of canon law or the rituale, so he's not always reflecting the current practice of the church. Like, what do you do if a priest dies during Mass? Like, how do you handle the Eucharist? Or he has some speculation, like, well, when we start going to these Arctic regions, it's going to be too cold to have wine, so how are we going to handle that? And he doesn't always have the answer that the church decided on, but it's fascinating to see his reasoning and is trying to figure it out.
Starting to think of that, and then and even I mean, I love that idea though. Is that you said it earlier about what he's thinking about going to the the Arctic region. It's that pretty much of that Dominican impulse of going out into the world.
He's like, how are mission? He's wrong. It's not what the church decided, but he's like, well, maybe we won't be able to bring wine, but the Eucharist is so important. We'll just consecrate the host. You're like, well, that's not right. But he's trying to figure it out and just putting ideas forward.
It's that zeal,
it's everyone needs the Eucharist, so let's think about how we're going to bring it everywhere as we continue to go.
Touch everyone. I love that. I love that idea of the spirit. I think that's one thing we really see, with the Dominican charism is that there's just always the spirit of going out and teaching and preaching or reaching to evangelize. A lot of times you see writings now currently of some Dominicans, and they'll be like, well, the evangelization is not new. Evangelization is something we've done since the founding of the Dominicans, because we're always teaching and preaching and out there.
Right.
Let me ask you this, and this maybe I don't want to read too much into it, because we know that St. Thomas Aquinas was a student. And we have the beautiful writings that we have of Thomas Aquinas on the Eucharist. And can you see any influence or not, or he may have taken a little bit? Have you ever thought about it in that way, or am I just kind of making a connection that?
Right. There's definitely some influence, not necessarily only Albert on Thomas, but sort of that whole Parisian medieval scholastic tradition, like the certain questions treated in the Summa, some of them you see treated here. But it's not just because Albert thought of it and then Thomas treated it, because also Peter Lombard, Alexander of Hales. So they're sort of in that. I'm trying to think. There's places where you definitely see Thomas going further, what adjectives, how do we particularly describe the exact way Christ is present? Thomas is a little bit more hands-on with that. Okay. Albert really focuses on, he's given to us to nourish us. And wherever you see the appearances of bread or wine, because that's the appearance of food, Christ is there as spiritual food. So he jumps right to the purpose and the goal, but doesn't do the metaphysics in quite as much detail. So there's places where you see Aquinas going further, and yet Albert's right, because the Eucharist, the Christ is present in every fragment of the Eucharist, because every fragment of the Eucharist signifies spiritual food, and what is signified in a sacrament is truly there. So therefore Christ is truly there. So he sort of takes that idea of food all the way through, and he expands that idea a little more than Aquinas does. But
that's just I mean, sister, this is such a wonderful gift that you've given to the church and anyone just really wanting to study and really to dive in deeper in understanding his mind and his thought and his. And I think sometimes you see it because we have the book is offered on our website, Illumina Ecclesiae Press, with the Dominican sisters. It was actually published by Catholic University Press. Is that correct? Can you tell a little bit about the series that this is a part of?
Yeah. So Catholic University of America has a series where they've gone through the Fathers of the Church in translation. And they've been doing this series for decades. It's a well-known series. There's so many works.
These things don't happen overnight either.
Right, that too. And then they have a medieval section of it. So this is part of the medieval continuation of the Fathers of the Church. And it was wonderful to work with them because, first of all, if you're in that series, people know about the work because whatever library has that series gets it. But also their editors were just wonderful to work with. We were back and forth and working. They went through it with a fine-tooth comb and really helped me form my style. And I was so grateful.
How long did this take you?
Let's see. The dissertation translation was probably over 2 years while I was doing coursework and comps, but then it was about another year and a half making it fit their format and polishing it up. And because this work, the Latin hasn't been done in a critical edition yet, so a lot of the sources I had to sort of search for myself through the Corpus Christianorum and Patrologia Latina. So I've got my best guess is that all the authors he quotes are in here too, and I had to do that piece of it myself.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Sister Albert Marie, and I'm sure that this is not going to be the only contribution that you give to us in theology, and then all of the many students that you continue to touch, and just those of us in our community. We're very grateful for your gifts and how generously and really humbly you share this with all of us. So thank you very much, Sister. And if you enjoyed this episode of Mind and Heart, I encourage you to continue on and follow us as we've got more to share with you from the Dominican Sisters of Mary, Mother of the Eucharist. If you like this episode of the Mind and Heart podcast, I invite you to click on the next available podcast and continue to enrich your mind, heart, and soul.